So when it comes to Southeast Asian history, obviously we want to talk about the people who live there. When it comes to the modern Southeast Asian history, however, we can't ignore the fact that Europeans play a really big role. Their arrival there has a huge impact, and the world as we know it today is the product of that incredible encounter. And so that encounter began, I'd say, on the sort of the largest scale in the Philippines. 1511, we saw that the Portuguese captured Malacca. Okay, they got involved in things, started to, control trade and things like that. But in that same century, the Spanish came to actually control territory in the Philippine Islands, and that had a huge impact on the lives of the people there. It began in 1519, not with a Spaniard, but with a Portuguese, a guy by the name of Ferdinand Magellan, someone who had actually participated in the conquest of Malacca in 1511. He went back to Europe. He wanted, I think he wanted to get the King of Portugal to support some voyage or something, didn't get approval for it, and then went to the King of Spain, who allowed Magellan to make a voyage to try to find the Spice Islands so that they could gain access to the spices. As we saw before, though, the world had been divided by the Pope, where the Portuguese had control of things to the east of this certain line, the Spanish to the west. So Magellan tried to head to Asia by going westward, heading to the Americas, around South America, and then across the Pacific, first to Guam, but then to the Visayas, the islands in the center of the Philippines. I think Magellan thought he was going to make it across the Pacific in like 4 or 5 days or something like that. Ended up taking like 2.5 months or 3 months or something like that. But eventually they did arrive in the Philippines. And one of the first things they supposedly did was convert thousands of people to Christianity. I have no idea how this supposedly happened when you couldn't communicate with people.
Oh! But tidak perlu bicara. Ini mana jalan? Banana. Here. Mina dua.
But that was the beginning of this encounter, an encounter that ultimately turned badly for Magellan, as he created some enemies there and ended up getting killed. His men, nonetheless, decided to return. They did purchase some spices in the islands of what is today eastern Indonesia, where all the spices come from, and they made it back to Spain, or at least some of them made it back to Spain. I think something like, do I know those numbers? Something like 270 people left on that voyage, and something like 18 or 19 made it back to Spain. Ooh. So that's the type of thing where I think most people would say, let's just give up on this. This isn't going to work. But that's not what happened. And instead, in 1864, another voyage set sail for the Philippines, another Spanish voyage. And in 1865, this group of people began the conquest of the Philippines for Spain. Conquest that went quite rapidly, such that by around 1870, 1871, Manila was captured from its Muslim ruler, and the Philippines, from that point onward, really started to become a Spanish colony. So when we get to this issue of colonies, I think we have a lot of images in our head of what that looked like and how it worked. And those don't necessarily fit, I think, when we get with the Philippines, as this was a very kind of early example of European control of an area, and there were specific institutions that the Spanish brought with them, institutions that they had tested out to some extent in the Americas. So the first thing they did was to essentially appoint to the Spaniards who were there control of human beings. They established this system called the Encomienda system, which theoretically wasn't the granting of land to people, but instead it was the granting of human beings who lived in a specific area of land. So kind of the same, but not exactly. And these people were then supposedly obliged to give certain goods to the Spaniard who was in control of them, and in return, the Spaniard was supposed to do good things back to them, namely to convert them to Christianity, which most of these guys didn't do, but instead there were religious figures, often referred to as friars, who went to the Philippines, who established churches in the various areas, and who started to convert people to Catholicism. When they did so, they encountered a world of indigenous beliefs, a world controlled by people like the Babaylan. And there's a lot of evidence that the Spanish priests did not like these people and tried to suppress their powers. But we can also see clear ways in which the Catholic Church more or less grafted itself onto indigenous powers as well. And so, for instance, if there was a spot, say, on a waterfall where people believed there was some powerful spirit, the Spanish friars would come along and say, let's build a statue there of the Mother Mary or of Jesus or something like that, and start teaching people that this place is powerful because of Catholicism. So this is something that happened not only in the Philippines, but it happens all over the place, and it happens not just with Catholicism or Christianity, but with basically every kind of religion. And it happened in the Muslim world as well in unique ways, where these outside religions would come in and sort of graft themselves onto indigenous beliefs. Through these means, though, these outside religions do establish a foothold, and from there, develop into more institutional forms. And that's exactly what happened over time in the Philippines, and led to really the extensive Christianization of a large proportion of the population. That Christianization, however, did not extend down to the island of Mindanao, where the Muslims there resisted this Christian presence. And today, you have that religious divide as well. So religion was one big thing that the Spanish brought with them that transformed the population. Later, we'll see that, in a lot of colonial settings, people establish, say, mines or plantations. In this early period, that it isn't something that really happened yet. Instead, the Spaniards had their encomiendas, their sort of areas of people that they taxed or got products from. They also had other systems where they could demand that people sell them certain products at a certain rate, or that they provide labor to them, often free of charge for a certain period of time. And so, the end result would have been that for people in the Philippines, their worldview would have changed dramatically, but they would have found themselves laboring in various ways for these new arrivals as well. Sometimes in definitely exploitative ways, but a new reality was there. In establishing this system, though, this is not how the Spaniards, in establishing these systems of extraction or in establishing these institutions for extracting labor and goods from the Philippines, however, this didn't really produce a great deal of wealth for the Spanish ruling elite in the Philippines. And for that, though, they turned to another institution that they established. So one thing that Europeans really wanted at this time period was stuff from China, like China, the porcelain that comes from China. The only problem was the Chinese didn't want to trade with Europeans, and they didn't want any of the crap that Europeans produce. What they would be willing to accept, however, was silver. And as it turns out, the Spanish came up with a system for engaging with trade in trade with the Chinese. In the Americas, there were silver mines, and in the Americas, the Spanish had set up systems where they also demanded that people labor for them. And so what they did in this case was that they demanded that people mine silver for them. They then brought that silver to the Philippines. The Chinese, like I said, didn't want to trade with the Europeans and even banned Europeans from trading, but they didn't necessarily ban Chinese from going down to a place like the Philippines, where there were Europeans, and these Chinese then traded with the Europeans. So the Europeans got silver from the Americas, essentially money for nothing, because they had essentially slave labor getting it for them. They brought that to the Philippines, where they brought products that were brought down from China. Then they took those products from China, shipped them off to Europe, where they sold them at a great profit. Was known as the Galleon Trade, named after the ships, the galleon ships that carried these goods. And it was extremely profitable for the Spanish, and essentially was what kept this colony going for many years until competition came from other places and they changed the way that they were doing things. But that's something we'll get to later. For now, what we can see is the Philippines is the first place in the area that really started to be transformed by a European presence. But other places would feel that transformation, experience that transformation very soon. Oh, I almost forgot the Chinese. So another thing that happened in the Philippines that's very important is concerns the relationship that the Spanish established with the ethnic Chinese community there. Once the Spanish established a base in Manila, not only did Chinese come there to trade, but there are a lot of Chinese who actually settled there, thousands in fact. And many of them, did various kinds of work that was essential for the livelihoods of the Spanish there. From everything from making shoes and clothes, to building houses, to producing food, you name it, Chinese did it, and the Spanish relied on it. So they were very helpful and important for the Spanish, but the Spanish were also suspicious of the Chinese. And periodically, they would get so suspicious that they'd eventually decide to do something, which unfortunately took the form of a massacre. If you look, you can see, like on Wikipedia, they actually have this information where repeatedly there were these cases of Chinese massacres in the Philippines, where the Spanish, after a period of time, would get nervous about the Spinese community. The Spanish-Chinese, the Spinese community, where they would get suspicious about the Chinese community and would kill Chinese. Then, after killing thousands of Chinese, the Spanish would go, crap, we need people to make shoes for us and make clothes and build houses and grow food. Get the Chinese back here. And so the Chinese community would grow again, then the Spanish would freak out and there'd be another massacre. Then the Spanish would again go, who's gonna make our shoes and build our houses and grow food for us? And then the Chinese community would grow again, and then trouble would ensue. This complex and ambiguous relationship that the Spanish had with the ethnic Chinese community in the Philippines and in Manila in particular is something that we'll see happen in other parts of the region as well, particularly in Batavia on the island of Java under the Dutch. So the Philippines are the first place to come under large-scale colonial rule. And there are various things that happened there that we will see developed in other areas as well. There were other things about the Philippines, though, that were unique. But this is something we'll be looking at further as we get a sense of the other parts of the region that came under colonial rule.